The train screeched as it pulled into Dry Hollow Station, a single worn platform at the edge of the desert. Claire Whitmore stepped down onto the cracked planks, a wind full of dust brushing across her pale face and lifting the hem of her long, travel-worn skirt. Her boots, once polished and tight, now flapped at the seams. A single leather suitcase hung heavy from her hand. Inside, her world fit in 2 dresses, a faded photograph, and a comb missing 2 teeth. She stood still for a moment, letting the dry wind whip around her, the scent of sun-baked earth and horses replacing the perfume she'd once worn. Nobody greeted her. No porters, no driver, no familiar voices. She had known that would be the case. Still, her heart squeezed with the cruel reminder of it. The last telegram from her family hadn't even used her name. "Do not return." Claire turned from the train without a glance back and walked into town. Dry Hollow was little more than a cluster of wooden structures, hunched and sun-bleached like old men who had lived too long. A general store, a saloon with sagging shutters, a sheriff's office, half-shadowed by a lazy awning. She passed a group of cowboys leaning against the post outside the bar. Their eyes slid over her like grease. Not cruel, not kind, just curious in the way vultures were. Her steps slowed as she reached the main strip. Her mouth dry, her heart aching with exhaustion. Claire lifted her chin and walked through the swinging doors of the saloon. She didn't want whiskey. She wanted a question answered. But silence struck the room like a gunshot the moment she stepped in. Conversation stopped. Eyes turned. She ignored them and approached the bar. "I'm looking for land," she said. Her voice cracked but didn't falter. "Something abandoned. I heard there was a burned ranch just outside town. Belonged to a Ferguson family." The bartender, a man with a thick mustache and a belly that pressed against the shelves behind him, snorted. "You heard right. Burned down 2 years ago. Ferguson's all dead. Fire left nothing but bones and cinders." "I want it," Claire said. Laughter rippled through the saloon. A red-faced ranch hand tipped his hat back and said, "Ain't nothing out there but ghosts and ashes, sweetheart." Claire didn't even blink. "Then it shouldn't cost much," someone muttered. She crazy or just stupid? She turned and walked out. At the sheriff's office, she waited 10 minutes before the man inside bothered to acknowledge her. He was dozing with his boots on the desk, a bottle of something sour tucked behind a tin star. When he finally looked up, he squinted. "You don't look like you belong here," he said. "I'm not here to belong," Claire replied. "I'm here to buy land. The Ferguson Ranch. It's abandoned, correct?" He raised a bushy brow. "That's cursed land, miss. Ain't grown a blade of grass since the fire. No one claimed it. No one wants it." "I do," she said, reaching into her coat and pulling out a small pouch. The coins inside clinked. Barely enough to scrape by, but enough for a gamble. He studied her for a long moment. $3, he said with a smirk, "and it's yours. But don't come crying when the wind howls and nothing grows." She counted out the coins slowly. Her hands didn't shake. He scribbled something on a slip of paper, folded it, and handed it to her with a lazy shrug. "Congratulations, you're the proud owner of a heap of ash." Claire tucked the deed into her coat and left. The walk to the ranch took nearly 2 hours. She could have asked for a horse, but pride ran deeper than tired legs. The sky stretched wide and relentless overhead. No clouds, just endless sun. She walked until the town faded behind her and the land turned from dry scrub to something harsher, brittle mesquite and stones that crunched underfoot. When she finally crested the low ridge and saw it, her breath caught. The Ferguson Ranch had once been grand. You could see it in the bones. The wide layout, the blackened posts of the barn, the stone chimney that still stood tall against the sky. But now it was ruins. Charred beams scattered like corpses across the ground. A rusted weather vane leaned at an angle, and the skeletal remains of a corral stood like ribs from the earth. Claire stepped through the gate. It creaked and nearly fell off its hinge. She set her suitcase down in the remains of the house's front room, where walls were half missing and the roof long gone. Dust settled around her like a shroud. And still, she smiled. Because for the first time in a long while, this was hers. Not her father's home. Not her late husband's borrowed apartment above a factory. Not a boarding house where matrons whispered behind closed doors. This ruin, this shell, it was her beginning. The first night, she made a bed in the barn. What little of it remained. She nailed a blanket across a gap in the boards, stuffed straw under her coat for a pillow, and listened to the coyotes cry far off in the distance. The moon spilled silver through the broken slats above her. She traced the cracks in the wood with her eyes and whispered the names of people she no longer had. Her mother, her husband. When the tears came, she let them. No one could see. The next morning, she began to work. Claire knew nothing of carpentry. But she had hands, and they still worked. She cleared debris from what was once the porch, dragging scorched timbers and piling them to the side. By midday, her palms bled. She wrapped them in strips torn from her petticoat and kept going. She found a rusted shovel behind the barn and began digging out the old well. Stones shifted. Her arms trembled. The sun beat down without mercy. And still she worked. On the fourth day, her body gave in. She collapsed next to the well, her breath short, lips cracked, fingers blistered. Her throat burned and her muscles throbbed. She lay there, dust clinging to her skin, staring at the sky. And for the first time, doubt crept in. But as the wind passed through the dead branches of a nearby tree, whispering like ghosts, Claire sat up. She pulled herself to her knees. Then, to her feet. She wasn't dead yet. That night, she ate the last of her jerky and drew a shaky breath as she stared at the small scrap of paper she'd written on. The town might have laughed at her, but maybe, just maybe, there was someone out there who needed what she had. A meal, a place to rest, and work that needed doing. She walked to the general store the next morning, her hands wrapped in cloth, her face sunburned and bruised with exhaustion. She found a hammer, a nail, and a weathered post near the town entrance. With trembling fingers, she nailed up the sign. "Help needed. I can pay in meals, not money. Woman alone." She stared at it for a long while, then turned and walked back to the burned ranch, the wind at her back and hope, faint and stubborn, in her chest. Behind her, the sign creaked in the breeze, waiting for the one soul who might answer. Jed stood in the barn doorway, long after the rooster had crowed, hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee gone cold. The morning fog still curled in the low fields like it hadn't decided whether to stay or lift. He should have been mending fence or checking on the calf that was due soon. But he hadn't moved since Clara left the day before. Something about the way she'd rushed out, faster than usual, eyes scanning the tree line like she was late for something heavier than chores, stuck in his chest like a splinter he couldn't dig out. It had been almost 2 months since she started coming. His house no longer smelled of must and quiet. The floor shone. The windows let in light. The curtains moved gently with the breeze like someone had remembered to open them. He told himself he hired her out of practicality, and maybe that had been true at the start. But now, when she didn't come, the hours stretched out in a way that felt unbearable. He'd asked her once if she lived far. She'd just said, "Not too far," with a small smile that shut the door on any more questions. He didn't push, but now he couldn't stop thinking about it. That afternoon, he took his horse and rode into town under the excuse of needing a new bag of feed and a bolt of cloth. The general store was quiet, save for the clerk's boy sweeping the back aisle. Jed picked out what he needed and lingered, waiting, watching the road like Clara might show up again, but she didn't. He rode slower on the way home, eyes catching every trail leading into the woods that bordered the far east of his land. It was instinct, not plan, that made him tug the reins when he reached the fork near the dry creek bed. The sun was lower than it should have been for a detour, but something tugged at him. The trail narrowed, branches brushing his coat until the path turned to gravel and dust. That's when he saw it. A slanted shack with weathered boards and a stovepipe coughing out weak smoke. It looked like it had once been a miner's hut, long abandoned, but someone had patched it with care. Clothes hung on a line strung between 2 trees. A small wooden crate had been turned into a makeshift step at the door. He stopped his horse behind a thicket and dismounted silently. The door creaked open and Clara stepped out holding a pot of stew. She wore the same scarf he'd seen her in at the ranch, though the colors looked more faded now in the dying light. And behind her came movement, 4 small figures tumbling out after her like chicks after a hen. One of them, a girl of maybe 10, reached for the pot. Clara gently pulled it higher, shaking her head, then poured the contents into 5 tin bowls. The children sat on the steps and dirt with the ease of routine, cradling their meals like treasures. Jed stood still as stone. Clara didn't speak to the children as they ate, but her eyes stayed on them, watching, measuring how much each child had taken. The youngest, a girl no older than 4, spilled some of hers and burst into tears. Clara scooped her into her arms and whispered something only she could hear, rocking her gently. The others looked away, pretending not to notice. That was the kind of family this was, one where sorrow didn't get indulged for long because survival didn't allow it. Jed swallowed hard. He hadn't known. Not once had she let it slip. All this time, she'd shown up with clean clothes and steady hands, scrubbing his floors while her own children waited hungry in a shack. He turned before she could see him. He didn't want pity to be the first emotion between them. Back on the ranch, he unsaddled the horse in silence, every motion tight with guilt. The next morning, Clara came as usual. She didn't seem any different, but Jed couldn't look at her the same. When she went to refill her bucket, he laid $2 extra on the counter and set a small bag of dried beans beside it. She returned and paused at the sight, her hand hovering over the money. "Pays more today," he said, pretending to oil the hinges on the back door. She didn't argue, just tucked the bills away, quietly sliding the bag of beans into her basket. He didn't ask about the children. She didn't offer. But from then on, he left small things without comment. A half loaf of bread, a block of cheese that wasn't moldy yet, a pair of mittens left drying by the stove that he insisted he had no use for. Weeks passed like that. Little by little, the distance between them shortened, though neither ever said a word about it. One day, she came late and looked apologetic. "I had to see about my youngest," she said. "Fever." Jed nodded, then hesitated. "She all right?" Clara's shoulders relaxed a fraction. "Better now." He cleared his throat. "You bring 'em here if it's bad. Cabin's got space. Stove works." She didn't answer right away, just returned to scrubbing the sink. But he noticed her eyes stayed damp longer than usual that day. The first time she brought them, it was because the rain had come down fast and cold, and they were waiting outside in it. Jed opened the door without a word. The kids filed in one by one, polite, quiet, soaked through. Clara stood just inside the door, clutching her shawl. "They'll stay out of your way," she promised. "They don't have to," Jed replied. Ben, the middle boy, was the first to speak. "You got horses?" Jed cracked the smallest of smiles. "Sure do." From that moment, it was like the ranch exhaled. The kids moved through it with curiosity and reverence, never breaking things, never loud. The older girl, Lily, helped in the kitchen without needing to be asked. Ben followed Jed into the barn and watched him repair a saddle, asking questions like a sponge soaking water. Tommy, the quiet one, sat near the hearth with a sketchbook Clara had packed in her basket. The youngest, Ellie, found a doll forgotten in the attic and treated it like gold. Jed didn't say it aloud, but he looked forward to their visits more than anything now. Clara moved more freely when the children were around, her laughter peeking out in rare bursts. He caught himself watching her from the porch, not out of scrutiny, but peace. She belonged there more than the silence ever had. One morning, he found Lily folding his shirts. She did it the way his wife used to, tight and neat, like care folded into fabric. He didn't stop her. "Ma says you're kind," she said without looking up. He blinked. "Does she? She says not many folks are. He nodded once. "Well, she's kind too." Lily gave a small smile and kept folding. After they left that evening, Jed sat at the table with 5 empty mugs still warm from cocoa and a rag doll tucked under the bench. He didn't move it. The next week, Clara came without the children. "Rain's coming," she said. "Didn't want 'em caught in it." Jed nodded. He noticed her hands trembled when she set down her basket. "You all right?" She hesitated. "I'm just tired." He stepped aside so she could sit. She didn't argue this time. She folded her hands in her lap and stared at the fire. "I never meant for you to see that shack," she said quietly. "I know. I didn't want pity. This ain't pity." She looked at him then, her eyes full of shame and gratitude knotted together. "I do my best," she whispered. "I know you do." A long silence stretched between them. Then she said, "My husband left 3 years ago. Disappeared one night. I thought maybe he'd died. Turns out he just didn't want to be poor anymore." Jed nodded slowly, watching the flames. "Men like that run easy," he said. She looked at him. "What kind of man are you?" He didn't answer. Not right away. Then he said, "One that don't run." The fire popped. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. She stood, smoothing her skirt. "I'll bring the children again next week." "You can bring them whenever you like," she nodded. "Thank you." As she stepped outside, rain began to fall, slow and steady. Jed followed her to the porch and watched her lift her shawl over her head. He wanted to offer her a coat, a ride, 100 things. But she was already moving down the road, the rain soaking the hem of her dress. He stood there until she vanished around the bend, the scent of rain and wood smoke curling in the air. And for the second time, that strange stirring returned to his chest. Not pity, not charity. It was something deeper, something dangerously close to hope. The ranch awoke to the scent of earth, turned fresh by morning dew, a rare gift in a place so starved of moisture. Taza was already up, his figure outlined against the pale orange sky as he leaned a beam into place near the edge of the new barn wall. Claire stood barefoot on the porch slab, sipping weak coffee from a tin cup, the steam rising to meet the cool air. Her blouse was damp from washing, clinging to her collarbones, her hands still raw from yesterday's work, but her eyes carried something different now, less fear, more certainty. The changes came slowly but surely. What had once been a hollow, haunted land was now stirring, like a slumbering creature lifting its head. Birds returned to the rafters, their calls filling the space that had long stood empty. The barn, though still skeletal, now stood tall enough to cast a shadow. The fencing line had stretched further with each passing day, repaired where it had fallen, and extended to define the property Claire had fought to claim. She brought Taza a cup of coffee, his hand brushing hers as he took it. He nodded his thanks as always. "I think we could get a few hens soon," she said. "If I can trade some stitching work for them." He took a sip and looked over the field where they'd started planting onions and carrots. "You'll need a coop." "I'll build one." He raised a brow, only half in jest. "You'll hammer your fingers off. I've only hit my thumb 4 times this week." "That's improvement," he said with a trace of a smile. She chuckled, the sound light, drifting between them with the breeze. Then she stepped away, brushing her hair behind her ear, and bent down to pull weeds from the garden row. Later that afternoon, while they worked side by side installing a doorframe in the newly rebuilt front wall of the house, a rider appeared at the edge of the horizon. Dust rose behind him, his silhouette swaying slightly in the saddle. Taza noticed first. He stepped away from the wall, his body going still. Claire turned, following his gaze. The rider approached without haste, but there was no friendliness in his posture. His boots hit the ground with a practiced thud as he dismounted and tied his horse to a fence post that hadn't yet settled in the ground. Silas McKenna wore a coat too fine for work and spurs too polished for a man who claimed to ride for business. His mustache was trimmed, his eyes sharp as cut glass. "You've done a lot with the place," he said, glancing around. "Looks almost livable again." Claire stepped forward, arms crossed. "We're not selling," McKenna chuckled. "Didn't say I was here to buy." Taza stood beside her now, his presence unspoken but unmistakable. I just came to see what kind of folks would pour sweat into a dead plot of land, McKenna said. It's impressive, really. Most would have given up. But then again, not everyone's stubborn enough to think hard work can fix bad history. This land isn't yours to talk about, Claire said, voice flat. But see, that's where you're wrong. McKenna moved closer, his boots kicking up dust. I made an offer before. That deed? It's a joke. Sheriff's too drunk to know what's legal. One of these days, the state'll want it back, and I'll be the one waiting with real paperwork. Claire's jaw tightened. Taza said nothing. McKenna looked over at him. And you still hanging around? You do know you're making it worse for her, don't you? Ain't many folks who'll trade or help when they see her running with your kind. Claire stepped forward, eyes blazing. You need to leave. He studied her. Suit yourself. He climbed onto his horse and turned. But before riding off, he said, just remember, fences don't keep out the wind. And I've seen enough storms roll through this town to know which ones flatten everything. When he disappeared over the ridge, Claire stood in silence. Her breathing was shallow, fingers clenched. Taza picked up a post and drove it into the ground with a sharp, clean strike. I don't care what he says, she whispered. I know, Taza replied. But both of them knew it wasn't about words. McKenna had power in the town, money in the pockets of every man who mattered. And he didn't bluff. Not when he wanted something. The next day, a new rhythm began. Taza started rising earlier. He checked the fence lines more often. Sometimes he disappeared into the hills for hours, returning with new bundles of brush or stones. Claire noticed how his eyes never stopped moving, always scanning, reading the land like a tracker, sensing a trail no one else could see. They added a bolt to the door, reinforced the barn from the inside. Claire took to carrying the rifle Taza had cleaned and restored, something left in the ashes of the Ferguson family's past, now reborn with purpose. Still, the work went on. They built the coop, traded with an old widow for 3 hens. Claire taught herself how to trap small game and started curing meat in the smokehouse Taza had helped raise. At night they sat on the porch, sharing coffee or broth, the silence between them warm now, not awkward. He told her stories, rarely and quietly. Memories of a river in Arizona, the color of blue she'd never seen, of a sister who used to braid feathers into his hair. She shared pieces of her past, too, how her husband had worked in a textile mill, how he died in a fire because someone locked the emergency doors to keep the women from taking breaks. She didn't cry when she told it. She just looked out into the dark, and Taza let her talk without interruption. You ever think you'll leave? She asked one night. He looked at her, his face half lit by the flame. Used to think I was supposed to. Never had a reason to stay. And now? He didn't answer. The next morning, Claire went into town to trade sewing work for supplies. The general store was quiet when she entered, her presence drawing eyes as usual. The storekeeper's wife barely hid her sneer as she handed over the goods. Claire paid it no mind. She was used to being looked through. But as she stepped outside, she saw 2 young men spitting into the dust, talking just loud enough for her to hear. Crazy woman, rebuilding that place with a savage. Bet she sleeps with a knife under her pillow. She's got more grit than brains, that's for sure. Claire held her head high and walked away. But by the time she returned to the ranch, her lips were tight and her knuckles were white from gripping the reins. Taza didn't ask what happened, but he looked at her long enough for her to know he understood. She handed him the cloth she'd traded for, a soft blue swatch. He nodded, tucked it into his saddlebag without comment. 2 nights later, a stranger came to the ranch. He didn't get far. Taza heard the movement first, light footsteps along the outer fence. He didn't call out. Instead, he moved like smoke, slipping into the shadows, eyes narrowed. Claire waited inside the house, rifle ready, heart pounding. A rusted hinge groaned. Taza struck without hesitation, catching the intruder by the collar and slamming him against the wall of the barn. It was one of McKenna's ranch hands, young, too thin, with sweat beading on his brow. I wasn't gonna do nothing, the man stammered, just looking. Then look somewhere else, Taza growled. The man scrambled away into the night. stumbling over his own feet. When Taza returned, Claire hadn't moved. "Someone was testing us," he said. Her fingers tightened on the rifle. "Then we make sure they don't test us again." From that day on, the ranch no longer felt like something they were building. It felt like something they were defending. They worked harder, faster. The outer fence was fully closed in. The well was reinforced. Claire planted thorny shrubs along the main gate to slow anyone trying to approach unseen. Taza rigged a bell to the back post, to chime if disturbed. Despite everything, life still pushed through. The garden began to sprout. The hens laid their first eggs. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent of mesquite and new green shoots. One morning, Claire stepped outside and felt, for the first time, that she wasn't just surviving. She was winning. She found Taza fixing the edge of the barn and walked up behind him. "I want to carve a sign," she said. He looked at her. "One that says this is ours." He nodded once. "I'll find the wood." She smiled. It was real and full of light, and when they went to bed that night, Claire fell asleep listening to the sound of the wind through the rafters. And, not for the first time, she dreamed of what it would be like if he never left. The sky cracked open before dawn. Thunder rolled low and deep, a warning across the horizon. The clouds were heavy with storm, darker than soot, pressing down on the hills like a beast settling in for the kill. Wind bent the mesquite trees toward the earth, and the smell of wet dirt rose thick into the air, mingling with the tension that had been building for days. Claire stood at the front of the house, sleeves rolled to her elbows, a lantern flickering beside her as she stared at the fence line. Her hands were clenched around a rail, knuckles pale from pressure. She hadn't slept. Not really. Not since the night Taza caught McKenna's man skulking near the barn. Not since the chickens scattered at midnight and the dogs howled without reason. She turned as Taza came up beside her. He had returned from the ridge just moments earlier, soaked in sweat despite the chill, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Tracks," he said. "3 horses, circling from the west. They didn't get close enough to be seen." Claire's stomach sank. "They're watching us." He didn't respond. Instead, he handed her a leather pouch filled with cartridges. "Keep them dry, and don't wait to shoot if they cross the gate." She nodded, swallowing the knot in her throat. "I'll boil coffee." The storm rolled closer, and the light faded early, stealing color from the land until everything was gray. The chickens were silent. The garden bent low. Even the wind seemed to hush, waiting. By sunset, the clouds broke, and rain came down in heavy, slanting sheets. Thunder shook the barn walls, and the old oak near the well trembled with every gust. Claire kept her rifle loaded, leaned against the table. Taza crouched near the doorway, knife on his belt, bow slung over his shoulder, watching the road like a statue carved from dusk. Neither spoke. The first rider came into view just after nightfall, a shadow moving through the rain. Then another. Then a third. Lightning split the sky, and for a brief moment they were visible. Faces hidden by slicker hoods, rifles strapped to their saddles, firelight reflecting in the barrels. Claire's pulse raced in her ears. Her fingers gripped the stock of the rifle, slick with sweat. She forced herself to breathe slow, deep, to stay calm. Taza didn't move. He waited. The riders stopped at the gate. "You've got one chance," a voice called. It was deep and unmistakable. "McKenna. Come out, woman. Bring the Apache. Leave the land and go, and maybe we won't burn it down with you inside." Claire stepped forward. "It's mine. You'll have to kill me." A pause. Then laughter. "Don't tempt me, sweetheart. This land was never yours to take." Taza's voice rang out, steady and sharp. "Neither was it yours." Another silence. Then a gunshot cracked the air, striking the gatepost. Wood splintered. The horses reared. Taza vanished into the rain, moving with fluid, silent precision toward the fence line. Claire ducked behind the window frame, heart pounding, eyes scanning the yard. Another shot rang out, closer. Then another. The storm swallowed the sounds, turned everything to confusion. Claire spotted a figure dismounting. She raised her rifle, breath held. The figure crept along the side of the barn, lightning flashing just long enough for her to see the glint of metal. She fired. The man dropped, screaming, clutching his shoulder. He crawled backwards into the mud, leaving a trail behind him. A horse bolted and disappeared into the dark. Claire reloaded with trembling hands, fingers fumbling. From the far corner of the property, a flare of movement. Taza lunged from the shadows, striking down a second man with the butt of a rifle. The man hit the ground with a wet thud, groaning. Taza disappeared again into the storm. McKenna's voice barked something, followed by more shots. The barn shuddered. The coop exploded in a burst of feathers and shattered wood. Claire ducked behind the stove, teeth gritted. A bullet tore through the wall just inches above her head. "Taza!" she screamed. No answer. Her heart stopped. Then, through the door, a man stepped into the house. Not McKenna. One of his thugs. Drenched, panting, eyes wide. He spotted Claire and grinned. "Pretty thing," he said. "You should have taken the money." She raised her rifle, but too slow. He swiped it away, the weapon clattering to the floor. He grabbed her wrist, twisting. She kicked, fought, screamed. He slammed her against the table, knocking over the lantern. Shadows danced across the walls. Suddenly, the man jerked, eyes going wide. A blade appeared beneath his ribs, Taza's knife. He gasped, choked, then collapsed onto the floor in a heap. Claire fell back, coughing. Taza stepped over the man, blood on his shirt, breathing hard. "You all right?" She nodded, barely. More gunfire outside. Claire ran to the door and slammed it shut. "There's still one more." Taza grabbed her arm. "Stay here." "No, I'm not hiding." He looked at her for a moment, then gave a short nod. He handed her the rifle. "Then come." They stepped outside together, rain soaking them instantly. Mud sucked at their boots, the wind screamed. Across the yard, McKenna stood alone now. His men were gone or down. His slicker flapped like wings, his gun aimed straight at them. "You don't know when to quit," he shouted. "You could have walked away." Claire raised her rifle. "So could you," he fired. Taza shoved Claire aside. The bullet grazed her arm, slicing through fabric and flesh. She cried out but didn't drop the rifle. She fired. McKenna staggered back, hit in the shoulder. His gun fell from his hand. He stumbled, then dropped to one knee. Taza approached him slowly, knife still in hand. McKenna glared up at him. "Go on then, finish it." Taza stared at him. "You're not worth the stain." McKenna sneered, clenching his shoulder, blood pouring down his side. The sheriff arrived minutes later, drawn by the noise, or maybe the rumors finally catching up. He stepped down from his horse, soaked to the bone, eyes wide at the sight of bodies in the mud, smoke curling from the barn, and Claire standing with a rifle in her hands. She said nothing, just handed it over. Taza stood beside her, silent. The sheriff looked between them and the wounded McKenna, then sighed. "Reckon it's time someone reminded this town whose land is whose." He turned to McKenna. "You come back here, I'll bury you myself." McKenna didn't answer. He was too busy bleeding. By morning, the rain had stopped. The ranch was still standing. Claire stood by the well, her arm wrapped in cloth, watching the sun rise over the battered yard. Chickens pecked around the coop debris. The barn door hung crooked. The wind carried the smell of gunpowder and ash. But the fence still stood. The house still stood. Taza walked up beside her, his shirt clean now, his hands still stained with blood. "You stayed," she said. He looked at her. "So did you." She reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. The sky burned gold over the hills, and though the storm had passed, its mark remained, not as ruin, but as proof. They had fought, and they had won. The days after the storm passed slowly, like waking from a fever. The sun returned, cautious at first, warming the mud into soil and drying the broken boards scattered near the barn. Smoke no longer rose from the ruins, but the scent of it still lingered in the walls, mixing with sweat, soil, and something new, something cleaner, the scent of something beginning. Claire walked the edge of the property with her sleeve rolled up, the wound on her arm clean and healing but still sore. Taza had cleaned it in silence, his fingers gentle but certain, the way a man works when he's done it too many times before, on battlefields with known names and friends who never got back up. He hadn't said much since that night. He didn't need to. The space between them no longer held questions. They had stood together against what came, and the land had witnessed it. Claire replaced the coupe piece by piece. She worked slow, one nail at a time, and when her arm ached, she'd stop, stretch, and keep going. Taza repaired the barn door without being asked, his hands steady, moving as though it were always his to mend. They didn't talk about McKenna or the sheriff or the blood soaked into the ground near the fence post. The town had gone quiet. Eyes followed Claire when she rode in to trade, but nobody spit. Nobody muttered. Respect didn't come easy out here, but once it did, it settled in like a root under stone. Taza brought her cedar to carve the sign. He handed her the plank without a word and left her on the porch with a knife and the soft morning light. She sat for hours, whittling each letter into the grain. When she was done, she held it up, tilted her head, and smiled. Then she nailed it to the fence post at the edge of the road, right where McKenna had first stopped. Rebuilt with love, worth more than $3. By spring, green pushed through the earth like a promise. The garden bloomed, carrots and onions first, then corn. Beans crawled up the trellis she'd built with twine and leftover fencing. The hens were laying steady now. Claire had 3 baskets in the kitchen, filled with eggs and bread wrapped in cloth. The house, though still rough, had warmth. Curtains over the window, a rug made from stitched-together scraps. The front door swung clean on its hinges and latched tight. Taza moved in without a word spoken between them. One night he laid his blanket beside the hearth instead of out in the barn. The next morning she handed him a cup of coffee before he'd even stood up. Neither mentioned it. But after that, there was only one bed. They married in late April. No priest. No papers. Just the two of them, standing beneath the old oak tree that had somehow survived fire and storm, its limbs thick with new leaves. Claire wore a dress she'd patched and cleaned until it gleamed soft white in the sun. Taza wore a fresh shirt and tied a turquoise bead around her wrist, threading it onto a leather cord he'd braided himself. She smiled as he tied it. "What does it mean?" "That you are rooted now," he said, "and the wind can't move you." They kissed once, simple and quiet, and spent the night in each other's arms, while the wind moved gentle through the fields. That summer brought the kind of heat that curled leaves and tested men's patience. But it also brought bounty. The garden overflowed. Taza taught Claire how to build a smokehouse that kept the meat good through the worst weeks. They trapped rabbits, hunted deer, cured the hides and hung them to dry behind the barn. She learned how to shoot without bruising her shoulder. He learned how to read slowly, with her finger guiding his under each word, smiling every time he got one right. Sometimes they'd sit on the porch and read aloud together. She found an old book of poems in the general store and brought it home wrapped in brown paper. He listened to her voice like it was music, his hand resting on her knee, his eyes never drifting far. Children came in time. First a boy, born in the soft stillness of an October morning, his cry strong and clear like wind through the canyon. Claire named him Elias. He had his father's eyes, sharp and thoughtful, and her smile. Then came a girl, then 2 more boys, spaced by years and harvests, and the slow, steady rhythm of a home built from work, not luck. The ranch changed with them. Fences extended. Animals increased. A second well was dug. Claire built a cradle with her own hands and cried when Taza sanded it smooth and painted it with red earth from the mesa, just like the patterns his mother once taught him. They planted a new tree each time a child was born. By the 5th spring, the edge of the house was lined with saplings. The town changed too. Some people never came around, but others did. A woman named Ruth started bringing extra fabric when she came to trade. An older rancher left seeds at the gate after the second baby was born. The sheriff stopped drinking as much. Or Maybe he just stopped showing it. One day, a boy from town wandered onto the ranch, wide-eyed and scrawny, his clothes ragged and his stomach empty. Claire found him near the garden, stealing beans. She didn't yell. She handed him bread. Taza showed him how to feed the chickens. By nightfall, the boy refused to leave. They let him sleep in the barn. By the end of the week, they called him family. Claire never forgot the nights she'd spent alone, blistered and broken, crying in the dark. She carried those memories like fire inside her, never letting them cool completely. They reminded her to stay kind. They reminded her what it meant to be unwanted. She and Taza opened their doors more often. A woman with bruises showed up one night, crying and barefoot, holding a child. They took her in. A wounded dog limped through the field. They fed it and let it stay. One fence post at a time, they built a place where no one was turned away. Years passed. Lines deepened in Claire's face, but her eyes never dulled. Taza's hair grew silver, but his shoulders stayed strong. The children grew wild and smart, running through the pasture, chasing chickens, catching snakes, and laughing with mouths full of cornbread. The house filled with music, stories, and warmth. Nights passed by firelight, with hands held and secrets shared under wool blankets. Winters were hard, but never cold inside. Summers were dry, but the well never ran empty. And always, at the edge of the road, the sign remained. Rebuilt with love, worth more than $3. Travelers would stop and ask about it. Claire would smile and pour them coffee, telling them about a storm, a fire, and a stubborn woman who refused to quit. Sometimes, she told them about a man who showed up without saying a word and stayed until the end of all things. Sometimes she just smiled and let the wind speak for her. One night, long after the children were grown and the trees had stretched tall enough to cast evening shadows over the porch, Claire sat beside Taza, their fingers laced together. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Did you ever think it would turn out like this?" He looked at her, kissed her forehead. "Not even in my dreams." They sat in silence, listening to the wind. The ranch was quiet. The stars stretched wide overhead. And somewhere in the barn, a newborn foal took its first breath under the soft nudge of its mother. Life continued, slow and steady. And though the world changed around them, the ranch stood still. A place built not from bricks or boards, but from grit, kindness, and the love of two people who had nothing left when they found each other, and everything after. In the heart of a forgotten land, where ashes once whispered of endings, Claire and Taza built a legacy not from wealth or luck, but from love, resilience, and the courage to begin again. Their story reminds us that even the most broken places can bloom when two souls choose to stand together. If this story moved your heart and stirred your spirit, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles, where tales of grit, romance, and redemption ride strong through the dust of the frontier. More unforgettable love stories from the untamed West await you. Saddle up and join us.